And welcome back to All Day Live. If you were watching us the last couple of days, we've had some live press conferences where Governor Walz has been speaking. And the first day he talked about, he was asked about the National Guard, and he said that he's preparing for them to come here. So the next day, yesterday, when we were taking him live, a reporter said, "What do you mean by prepare?" And he clarified his comments yesterday, saying that he's preparing for the Trump administration to send the National Guard to Minneapolis in two ways. One, working on a legal strategy, and then two, communication. And to clarify, President Trump has not said specifically that he's going to send the National Guard to Minneapolis, but he has said that he is targeting Democrat-led cities and states, and he has mentioned Minneapolis in the past. So we wanted to just look into this a little bit more. Joining me now is Jim Burch, president of the National Policing Institute. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so before we start, I did want to just double down and emphasize that your organization doesn't come at this with any sort of intentional political agenda here. Do you want to kind of just explain?
Yeah, I think that's really important, Amy. Thank you. The National Policing Institute has been around for over 55 years, and one of the things we don't do and don't have is a political agenda. So our organization is strictly nonpartisan. It was created that way. On our board of directors include people who maybe identify as Republicans, those who identify as Democrats, and those who identify as independents. So politics is not part of our mission. We're solely focused on helping to advance policing in America.
Before we talk specifically about Minneapolis, I just wanted to give folks just a little bit of a lay of the land. There was a relatively brief activation of the National Guard in response to some unrest in Los Angeles. Governor Newsom sued, and that's tied up in the courts. The Guard went to D.C., Memphis to try to bring crime down, and then recently we've been talking about Oregon and Portland, where I believe that activation is on pause while the courts go through some of that today, actually. Chicago as well, where the Texas National Guard, we understand, is protecting an ICE facility just outside the city. So my question to you is, it's kind of broad, but as you watch all of this play out, what do you make of it?
Well, I'll begin by stating the obvious. It appears that this is what the administration wants to do, and the president does have the authority to call up the Guard, as do governors. And each of them within their authorities have different things that they can ask the Guard to do and authorize the Guard to do. So it appears that this is something that the administration is relying on, is likely to continue. From what we're able to see in places where this has occurred, there are some people in communities that love it, other people in communities that don't love it. But what's most important, I think, for us is that we focus on the way in which the Guard will play a support role to state and local law enforcement, which really have to be the primary entity responsible for public safety at the local level.
Yeah, and I would love to spend kind of the crux of the rest of our time talking about that and getting into some of those details. So as I mentioned, Governor Walz saying that part of the preparation is to get their legal ducks in a row, which you and I will not be able to untangle that here in this conversation. So I wanted to focus on the second thing that he mentioned, which was communication. So what does the governor mean by that?
Well, hopefully what the governor means, and I think he'd be making a really important point, is that communication between the folks that are working on the streets, folks in law enforcement working directly with a Guard, should the Guard be deployed, or with federal agencies, should they be asked to take on a public safety role of some kind. That communication is essential. It's absolutely vital, and it's vital for the purpose of protecting the community, making sure that one side knows what the other side is doing, and that they can communicate with each other to avoid what I think would be the worst outcome possible, which is situations where there's an unintended conflict between the two sides, where state and local law enforcement wasn't aware that the Guard or that a federal agency was going to be deployed in a certain area, or somebody is mistaken to not necessarily be law enforcement. That's the worst kind of thing that anyone wants to see here. And this is the reason why the state and local law enforcement agencies prepare for this kind of thing all the time. They work together to make sure they know how to communicate, to know what the protocols for coordination are. That is a vital thing for them to do.
Have we seen, and I'm just thinking about maybe some video and images that people have seen in the last few days in Chicago specifically, I believe at the ICE facility where there was a man who was hit in the head with like pepper balls. You know, we see things like that, and I think it's easy to sort of perceive that is what's happening. And again, we don't know exactly what happened there, but is that kind of what you're talking about when you say, you know, the communication piece of this is maybe needs to be firmed up a little bit?
Yeah, so as you point out, and I think it's appropriate and important to point out that neither one of us were in Chicago, so we don't know exactly what was going on there. But the best we can make of it is that, and I believe those were ICE agents. ICE agents were a protective role around their facility. Protesters were standing in close proximity to the facility. What I didn't see there, and I could have missed it, but I don't believe I saw state and local law enforcement. And so even if we did, I think what you would want to see is you would want to see a situation where there was coordination about what that barrier is meant to be, how far back people need to stay. There should be coordination between the two agencies around who's going to have responsibility for maintaining that perimeter or that barrier. That's the kind of communication and coordination that has to take place. If it doesn't, then we see a situation where one side may think the other side isn't helping.
Yeah, and thank you for clarifying, because I did jump over to kind of the ICE agents who were involved there. That was not the National Guard. But as it pertains to the National Guard, I think, you know, people might be curious, what is their role? And is what their role, what it should be? Is that what's actually happening and what we're seeing in these cities?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Amy. I think the Guard has the ability to be called up for all sorts of man-made and natural disasters, major incidents where they're needed. And this is not unprecedented, right? The Guard has been called up in the past for things that have occurred, disasters that have occurred, and for civil disturbance. And civil disturbance is the phrase used most often in association with National Guard deployment when it comes to things like First Amendment activities. So there's a key difference here that I think people have to understand. State and local law enforcement agencies practice, they're trained, they're educated on how to be involved in a First Amendment or protective free speech activity without being over-intrusive, understand how to keep the peace. That's a very different activity from responding to civil unrest. We have to be really clear about this. A protest or free speech activity is not the same thing as civil unrest. And so the Guard is most often talked about in terms of deployment related to civil unrest. Doesn't mean that it has to be limited to that. I don't believe that may be a legal distinction that maybe I don't understand, but I don't think it necessarily has to be that. But that's typically what each of the different entities are kind of expected or trained or anticipated they'll be doing.
You've been looking closely at what happened in D.C., and I mean, that's probably the biggest sample size that we have to look at, given the duration. What happened in D.C.? What did you see? Was there anything that concerned you, or you felt like, you know, in that situation, they were within their role, the National Guard?
Yeah, I think it gives us a great observation point. Though we weren't involved in any official briefings, I have no inside information on what happened in D.C. Our organization is located just outside of D.C., and so we certainly have heard a lot about it. And what it appears is that Guard and federal agencies were deployed primarily in both a protective type of a role as well as a kind of a deterrence, a visual sort of a presentation of presence. And so there was a lot of commentary about, National Guard being deployed or federal agents being deployed on the National Mall or near monuments and those kinds of things. And I think people were questioning, why deploy there if there's not necessarily a hot spot of crime there? And I don't know that that was necessarily the purpose of those specific deployments or assignments. It could be that they were meant to provide visibility, because visibility is important for some in the communities who feel comforted by knowing that there's a law enforcement presence. You may have seen reporting of some people in Washington, D.C. saying they enjoyed the presence of those troops and the additional law enforcement presence in their areas. Others, not so much, and that's understandable. People are going to have very different views about these kinds of things. But what's critical is, and what I did see occurring there and understand occurred there, is that there was an agreement between Metropolitan Police Department or DC Police and the federal agencies who were supporting them when they were in coordinated patrols in high crime areas. It was clear who had the primary authority. So it was the local police, DC Police, that had the primary authority and was acting as a law enforcement agency and making the stops, making the searches of individuals and vehicles and houses, making arrests. The federal agencies may have done some of that, but they were primarily in a backup or support role, as I understand it. And again, we weren't privy to any official briefings, but that's the way it appeared.
And so then I need to follow up because, you know, a lot of, there's been a lot of resistance from some Democrats who are leading some of these cities and states. We had Governor Pritzker from Illinois actually in Minnesota the other day talking about this. And then I saw one comment from him, I believe it was yesterday, where he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it was along the lines of, if they want to send the National Guard, you know, to my people or to Chicago, and he basically said they're going to have to come through me. So when we see that resistance, what do you make of that? Because everything is just political. It just is. Everything is.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's just kind of the nature of politics, right? Is that there's going to be some polarization, there's going to be difference in views, there's going to be a lot of statements made along those lines. And that's not necessarily something that the National Policing Institute is going to take a position on. But what I do think is vitally important is that we recognize that there are men and women who work in the streets every day providing public safety, and it's unfair to them and unsafe for them to be drawn into the middle of a political struggle. And so what we would advocate for is just keeping that in mind, that we don't want to put anyone in harm's way, whether they're in federal law enforcement, the Guard, or state and local law enforcement. They're trying to do a job. Let's leave them out of the politics if we can.
All right. Jim, thanks for your time today. Again, the National Policing Institute, if you want more information, website online, and you can get all kinds of information. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.